I once mentioned in Hebrew the word. Just one moment, please. Mitch, I'm sorry, I can call you back right away. I have a class. Can I call you back in half an hour? Oh, that's why I didn't call you back. I'll be right. Take care. Bye. I'd once mentioned that in Hebrew, the word world is olam. Olam. But sometimes the word olam is written with the vav deleted. It's read aleim. In Hebrew, the word la'aleim means to conceal. As much as God was obvious at one time, let's say during the first temple period, or even in Egypt during the 10 plagues, relative to what he could have been obvious, he was not sufficiently obvious, because he would have been obvious where he couldn't be denied. You understand? The Egyptians wouldn't have been pagans. They're only pagans because there's a certain degree of ambiguity where it's not on an absolute level God's presence. I'll give you an example. There's a beautiful word from the Maharal of Prague that on the first day of creation, all that existed was God. God said, let there be light. It was evening, it was morning, he said, let there be light. The second day of creation, God created the angels. Once God created the angels, God's omnipotence was no longer absolutely clear. Of course, if you're exposed to an angel and the angels have magnificent presence and spirituality, one could somehow mistaken the angel as a power independent of God. If there's only God, there's nothing else to recognize other than only God. But once there's an angel, or the angel is a different dimension of spirituality, it's a distraction. You don't see this clear. The world itself, even at the most obvious level, there's an aleim. There's a certain level of concealment. That's existence. Existence is concealment because if there has to be free choice, there has to be some degree of ambiguity that's up to man to take the initiative to do the right thing. Otherwise, we're back to square one. What's the purpose of existence if man has no free choice? So the world is always at some level of aleim, concealment. God is in concealment. Even though the Torah tells us when the Jews went into exile, and we speak about the tochacha, the curses, God says, Anochi haster aste ponai, I will go into concealment. That is concealment relative to what was considered obviousness in this existence. That then it's much more difficult. And then only through the pain and suffering, if you have an understanding and relative to certain protocols of truth, you have a chance to see it. You can see God despite his concealment. And that's what we're dealing with today. Today, it's Anochi Haster Rastabonai. The level of concealment is not to be believed. As he explained, so this existence, we're talking about until the coming of Mashiach. God is always in a state of concealment. Today, especially as the Ramchal explained, when evil rears its head, when people behave as if God doesn't exist at all, and as it says, at the time of the destruction of the temple, of the Beis Hamikdash, the people said to the prophet, they referred to dark as light, and light was dark. That's how conflicted they were. Evil was so, it's like a person, God forbid, is a drug addict, that when he craves for that substance, although you could explain to him in blazing letters how it's destructive and it will totally destroy his life, it doesn't resonate. It doesn't even penetrate his mind or his emotion. He's not touched by it. Evil could reach such a level of prominence and control in existence Man doesn't see the forest from the trees. Man doesn't even see the forest. Forget about the trees. They see nothing. All they see is what evil feeds them. That's what it is. It's clear. So right now we live in a time, everything is relative to the different degrees of concealment. The second state of time will be when God will reveal himself. He says the first time of concealment is now, what we lived in today's time. And what do we need that despite the concealment, there's certain indicators to be able to come upon the truth despite it. So I want to read you what intellect says. He says, one introduction, which is fundamental and crucial, he says, we see certain protocol systems in place today. For instance, he says, we see God's mercy. We see his graciousness. We see his power. So all that, the prophets depict God and explain him. The way he interacts with his existence, we see these things. We're talking about a person who believes in God. Person believes in God. Even though to us, he's not obvious in the sense of that it's convincing beyond any doubt. It's due to our belief. But based on that we do believe, we see whatever the prophet said he is. He's merciful, he's compassionate, he's gracious, and he's powerful, and he's exacting. We see all this. Now, it said that in the Amida, we say, God is great, that's chesed. Powerful is the attribute of justice. Awesome is the attribute of mercy. That's how we refer to him. And what do we say afterwards? Kel Elyon. He's the exalted God, meaning he transcends all that. And this is very important. God is absolute in every sense of the word. God is infinite. God only chose to relate to this existence within these three attributes, but in terms of his essence is unrelated to this. That's part of understanding. We only understand what we understand is because we process it within ourselves as being human beings. And we ourselves have limitation, and because of that limitation, God provides a perception of him that we're able to deal with. Beyond that, we have no relevance. But in terms of his essence, what we have to believe, he goes far beyond, unfathomable, because he himself is absolute and he has no relevance to any deficiency, which means he's infinite. He wills existence. Existence has no bearing on him. So every moment of relating to existence, he only relates because existence can only deal with that context of relationship because of who we are. It has nothing to do with who he is. Okay? He says that's a very basic fundamental. What happened at Sinai? The Ramchal writes elsewhere, when a prophet prophesies, how does he prophesize? Not through his human faculty of the brain. It directly connects to the soul of the person. A prophet is able to come upon information in one moment that even if a person will live 100 years, he couldn't come upon that amount of information. Why? Because anything we process and we come upon through our human faculty, it all has limitation. It's finite. Your brain has such a capacity. You have an IQ. IQ means whatever the intelligent quotient is. You could be an Einstein, but even Einstein had a limitation. When God communicates to a prophet, it's directly to the soul being a spiritual component relative to the physical. It's infinite, although it's not infinite, but it has something which touches on the infinite. So within a moment, God is able to communicate something or touch the person. It can take 20 lifetimes to be affected, what the person is affected in just one moment of being touched by God through that level of communication. That's what happens. When did we come to the realization that God is infinite? When? At Sinai, when God opened the heavens and the earth, and every Jew communicated with God in an awake state. That means every Jew was touched by God directly by the infinite. When we came there at that moment, we understood that's Yichud Hashem. Everything emanates from him. Otherwise, how do we know? You know, people ask for empirical evidence. There's no such thing as empirical evidence. It's not possible. There are too many variables. The world is too wide and deep that we're able even to come upon the truth through our own human initiative. It's only based on because God initially revealed himself to us, and through that communication, which is called that prophetic communication to us, did we come upon the truth that God is infinite and everything emanates from him. Otherwise, it's impossible to know. I once said, who was the first human being to come upon God? Avram Avinu. Abraham was born in a world that was God's presence was not known. Avram, through his quest for truth, came upon God. Did he come upon God? I mean, through his analysis, he says there could only be one being. It's not possible. Because whenever you do an analysis, if you have all the facts, and then you see every side of the equation, you say, and then you do the analysis, you say, if that's the case, it leads me to believe. But as a human being, in terms of the world, what you're able to see and what you're able to be aware of, it's an impossibility. Because you can't have all the variables. Do you know what's subterranean? Do you know what's the other end of the world? Do you know what's in the galaxies? You have no idea what's there. So how could you make an analysis and through the analysis says, therefore it must be? There may be 1,000 other reasons, other approaches, what it may be. So Avram, that he came upon God through his own initiative, he didn't come upon it. And therefore there was a therefore. It's an impossibility. Yichud Hashem only comes because God reveals himself to you. So the Midrash tells us that because he wasn't willing to succumb to the beliefs of his time, which was paganism, because he had too many questions, and he wasn't willing to succumb to all that level of influence, despite a threat to his life, God himself says, I am the source of truth. I am the source of everything. Because he wasn't willing to compromise his quest for truth, the source of all truth revealed himself to Avram. That's how things came about. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Avram did not come upon God. Because of his quest for truth, God came upon Avram and revealed to him what he revealed to us at Sinai. I am the source of everything. That's the concept of Yichud Hashem. Today, as Jews, we only have an inkling. Everything we have to be rooted in Sinai. Sinai is where it all began. That's where God irrefutably revealed himself to us, that he is the omnipotent one. Everything emanates from him. And you have to anchor it in Sinai. Now, whenever something's anchored, you have to secure that anchor. And you have to always shore it up to make sure it doesn't detach itself. How do you shore it up that it doesn't attach itself? God gave us Torah mitzvahs. He gave us mediums of spiritualization. Because those mediums, the Torah is God's wisdom. God says, when you study my Torah, you're directly connected to me. So at a level of connection, when you're connected to the source, then you don't waver. You may be beaten. The winds that blow may be overwhelming. But if you're connected to that source, and that's what it says, that all the winds and all the storms can blow. We may be battered, but we're still attached to that. We're rooted to where we're supposed to be rooted. I always say over the Klosenberger Rebbe. His name was Yekusiel Yehuda Halberstam of blessed memory. Zech Tzaddik Levrocha. He was the rabbi, Hasidic rabbi of Klosenberg. It was a city in Romania, Klosenberg. He was married. He had 11 children. He had a community, thousands of Hasidim. They were all murdered by the Nazis. And he was a Torah giant. He came to the United States. He came out of that Holocaust like a lion. He was going to rebuild. He had no questions. He understood the vision was so absolute, nothing could stop him from rebuilding, despite the pain, despite the loss that he had. So there's a famous story, which I heard. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zech Tzaddik Levrocha, was one of the leading Torah sages of the past generation. He was born in Russia, and he spoke Russian. So when there was Glasnost, and the Russian Jews came to the United States, he was one of the people who met them at the airport. And many of the older Russians who were born before the Russian Revolution, they remembered their parents, their grandparents, and some of them even spoke Yiddish, the elderly Russians. And he goes over to one of these Russians, an older man, must have been in his 70s at the time, and he says to him in Russian, "Do you remember anything Jewish from your childhood?" He was born just about the time of the Russian Revolution. He says, "No." He says, "Do you know Shema?" "No." "Do you know Modani?" "No." "Do you know anything, any verse from the Torah, any Hebrew words?" He says, "Yes, I know a verse in the Torah." She says, "What do you know?" He says, "What I know, there's a verse in the Torah, it says that all the travails and suffering comes upon the Jews, because you did not serve God with joy and good-heartedness. Yeah. You did not serve God with joy and good-heartedness. Rav Yaakov was taken aback. And people who speak Hebrew, who pray, they don't know this verse. And this Russian knows nothing, not even the Shema. This is the verse he knows. How's it possible? So he says to him, how are you familiar with this verse? And you even have it committed to memory. He says, "I'll tell you the story. I was in Auschwitz during the war, the concentration camp, and there was a rabbi there. And the Nazis wanted to torture him, and they wanted to break him. So what did they do? They took a 50-pound sack of salt, they saturated it with water, and they put it on his back, and they made him walk up and down a hill all day long with the sack of salt on his back. And every time he went to the bottom of the hill and he was about to make his ascent up the hill with this overwhelming, heavy sack of salt, he would give a groan and he would say, "Asher lo avarta, Hashem lo kech, v'simple tuv leiva." The reason why I'm experiencing this because I did not serve God with joy and good-heartedness. I served God begrudgingly. That's why I'm experiencing this. And he says, I heard it thousands of times. Every time he went to the bottom of the hill, he worked his way up the hill. Again, I heard that voice, that verse. So he says to the Russian, do you know what his name was? His name was the Klosenberger Rebbe. Yeah. He was seeing it through what lens? Loses a wife, 11 children, loses his community, thousands of followers, Hasidim. And he's being tortured in Auschwitz. And every time he groans, he says, it happened because I did not serve God sufficiently with joy and good-heartedness. How do you have such a perspective? Another person would lose his mind. He'd be broken and destroyed. And he was strong. Why? What medium did he have? The answer is, he was a Torah giant. That if you're rooted to the source and you're anchored and you have all the support systems to secure it, that it becomes impregnable, which is the mention of Torah and the way you observe the mitzvos, you can't be shaken, you can't be broken. Physically, you may be broken, but spirit-wise, emotionally-wise, mentally-wise, you're not broken. You merit a special divine assistance, infusion of clarity and inner strength. You're able to survive regardless, whatever it is. You go thick and thin because God is there holding your hand all the way through the process. During the war, the rabbi, the holy rabbi, never ate non-kosher. Never. And he was in the camp and he didn't have what to eat. He was starving. And even then, he never allowed non-kosher to come in his mouth. And he prayed to God that he should be able to withstand this test. Never that any non-kosher food should come in his mouth. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a person presents himself out of nowhere with a few loaves of bread. This is in the camp with a bottle of jam, and he gives to him. And as he wants to thank him, he disappears. And he sought him out in the camp afterwards. Did anybody see such a person? Is this person does exist? And afterwards he realized, it's clear, that because he sacrificed his life for the sake of the Torah, God sent an agent, Eliyahu Navi, to bring him the bread and the jam that he should be able to survive. That's the story. So again, tremendous concealment. But if nobody sees it, why do you see it? You know, it's a known fact. Larry could tell you this, because he made a commitment in the Yankee Stadium that if something happens, he's going to grow a beard. Right? It happened in the Yankee Stadium. If you want to be a pitcher, and you pitch at, I don't know how fast the ball goes, 90 miles an hour, 95 miles an hour, and you want to strike that pitcher out, your eyesight has to be so keen. It's like the eyesight of a sharpshooter. When you throw that ball at home plate with that man standing, you throw it away with such accuracy, but that actually is based on not only his mechanical skills, but his eyesight. He sees exactly. His eyesight is one of a kind. But he could see things you can't see. The sharpshooter ranger, he sees things that you can't see because he's gifted with that ability to see. A person who engages in Torah and uses those mediums to hone his senses, he has a level of clarity, understanding, and inner strength that you can't even relate to what that is. But it's only because he's been geared and shored up with all these mediums which God provided. So even in this concealment, you're able to recognize God. As a prophet, definitely not. But within the human capacity to be able to make choices continuously, correct choices, it's only due to this. That's now. We're not coming after coming Mashiach. After coming Mashiach, there'll be a different level of revelation. At the splitting of the sea, even the maidservant was able to point and said, that is my God, I will extol him. But these were unusual moments. It had nothing to do with maidservant. It had to do with God. Today, it has to do with us. Based on our initiatives, to what degree do we absorb and engage and immerse ourselves and allow these mediums to be part of ourselves? That would be the degree that we have clarity and understanding and that inner strength to be able to weather any storm. I'd once mentioned that when I was having my sparring session with the professed atheist, and he said to me, Rabbi, I understand where you're coming from, but if I would ask you a question, which you can't answer, would you come onto my side and accept my position that there's no God if you can't answer the question? So I said to him, I'll tell you the difference between me and you. Where you're coming from, you can only accept God if you understand. You need a proof. So since you have endless questions, which I could answer, but you're not willing to accept the answer, you're not willing to change your position. But if you ask me a question that I can't answer, it doesn't in any way refute my position and change my position. Why? Because my position is not based on what I understand, but it's based on what I know. I know God is the omnipotent being. I know everything emanates from God. I know God's the creator and things happen because he wills it that way. You'll ask me a question. Actually, you could ask me many questions, which I don't have the answer to. You'll ask me, why does the heart have 4 chambers? Even if I'd be the greatest doctor in the world, I couldn't give you the answer. The greatest pathologist in the world, couldn't give you the answer. It's a question I can't answer. By you asking me your question, I may not be able to answer the question, but it doesn't make, I don't have the answer because my basis is not based on what I understand, it's based on what I know. I know God is the creator. I know God is the omnipotent one. I know God wills all existence and everything emanates. How do I know it? Because it's factually, irrefutable fact. It goes back to Sinai. That's where I come from. Whatever I know and understand, that only secures what I know. That clarifies what I know. It gives me a greater appreciation for what I know. But it's not based on what I know. On what I understand, it's based on what I know. My understanding strengthens what I know. By you, it all starts what I know. So if you don't know, then you're in a place of, you're not in it, you're nowhere. That's the difference between me and you. And that's the reality of every Jew. The starting point is what we know. Now we talk about what we understand. In life, everybody could have a breaking point. God forbid. You know, we speak about the book of Job, the trials and tribulations of Job, the sufferings of Job, what he went through. And he came through unscathed, although he lost his wife, his children, his wealth, and he suffered personally. His belief in God remained steadfast. What Job went through, could other people go through? Probably not. But this goes back to the original principle, which we said, a test is only a test if you could withstand the test. Otherwise, I'm not testing you. I test your strength and I put 1,000 pounds on your back. That's not called testing your strength. That's crushing you. Every person's script in life is tailored according to his ability, what you could deal with. Anything which is beyond your capacity has no relevance to you. As a result of that, nobody could say, you shouldn't have failed because I would have been able to succeed. Just because you could have succeeded doesn't mean the other person could have succeeded. Not necessarily. You never know what goes into the equation of what's a test and what's not a test. But of course, it's only because we know that you're only presented with a test only because you could meet the challenge. That's the reason why you could meet the challenge. Because if God is the one who wills existence and it has a purpose and an objective, and if that's the objective, automatically I know that anything I'm challenged with, I have the ability to meet that challenge. Otherwise, it goes beyond the challenge. That's the reality. We delude ourselves and say it's beyond our capacity. But there's no question a person could be broken, but he won't be broken if he has this innate, steadfast belief that a test is a test only because you can meet the test. And that's the reality of life. And that's why a person who enters into a situation, which you shouldn't enter into that situation, you may fail because you're testing yourself. I'll give you an example. The Torah tells us we have to keep our distance from certain things. And the Talmud says a person is not permitted to go within 4 cubits of a brothel. Whenever you work by a house of idolatry, you're supposed to keep 4 cubits away. You're not supposed to go there. Why? Because once you go in there, you never know what's going to happen. Because you're exposed to an intensity of something which is the antithesis of spirituality, and you never know how you can be damaged. Person says, I'm strong, I'm going to go in. I'm going to prove to the world I could go into the brothel, and I'm going to walk out not tempted. Something. God's not looking for heroes. God doesn't want you to go in there. What are you going in there for? Let's say the person fails. Oh, we apply the principle. Well, if I had the ability to meet the challenge, I would have met the challenge. No, God didn't challenge you. You went there where God told you not to go there. So that you failed. You created your own temptation. When you create your own temptation, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily succeed. If you go out on a limb, on a branch, at the very end, as I'm not going to fall. Who said you're not going to fall? Who told you to go on the limb? You should have been in the most secure place. A person goes to a cliff. It's a 1,000-foot drop. And he goes to the very edge, and he's about to tip over. And he's going to show everybody how he can maintain his balance. And sure enough, he falls over. Why did he fall over? Because he behaved irresponsibly. You shouldn't have gone to the edge of the cliff. That there's a chance you could lose your balance. What are you trying to prove? It's the same thing. But anything where you live responsibly, and then you're challenged, that challenge you have the ability to meet. It's only self-imposed challenges. That's always a question. Do you have the ability? Don't you have the ability? Therefore, you have no right to go there initially.